Hello everyone, I'm Isobel Griffin. I'm the Vice Chair of the Icon Scotland Group. I'd like to welcome you all to our Take 5 webinar. Thank you very much for joining. This is the fourth we're holding of these events. We ran 2 last year and another one in May this year, and seeing as they always seem to go down well, we thought we would do another one before the summer holidays. And as those of you who are regular attendees will know, the format's pretty simple. 5 talks, each lasting 5 minutes, followed by a Q&A. Please do make the most of the Q&A, come up with some good questions and type them into the Q&A box if you don't mind, and flag up which speaker they're for, and then we'll cover as many as we can when we get to that point. An IT tip for this part of the webinar is to make sure you've selected speaker view, because then you'll only see the person who's speaking. And when we get to the end, we'll switch to gallery view for looking at the speakers. So as always, we've got 5 fantastic speakers lined up, including this time one who is nobly joining us in the middle of the night from Australia. And so without further ado, I'm going to introduce our first speaker. And we are honoured today in that our first speaker is the chair of the Icon Scotland Group, Gwen Thomas from Museums and Galleries Edinburgh. And Gwen's going to talk about sticky situation, interdisciplinary decision making in the conservation of a child's bedroom's cupboard door. So over to you, please, Gwen.
Thank you very much, Isobel. Yes, I gave it a really long title so that you would have to say the whole thing. Yes, I'm going to talk to you about a really cool object that I got to work on a couple of years ago now in 2018. Next slide, please. So the object is basically, as it said, it is a cupboard door from a child's bedroom, and it is completely covered in stickers on one face. It was covered by the child who slept in that room over about 13 years. And you've got a huge variety of different stickers from the Ghostbusters cartoon, which ran from 1986 to 1991 on the left-hand side here towards the middle, where there are 4 red circles around it, all the way through to a sticker that is just to the right of that, from the 2002 film Secretary. So you have the whole gamut there of sticker topics. It belongs to the Museum of Childhood, which is one of the museums that I look after, and it was acquired as a social history object, which reflected the changing interests of children at the end of the 20th century. In 2018, the National Galleries of Scotland requested to borrow the object, but not as a social history object. It was borrowed effectively to go alongside professional artworks in their collage exhibition, Cut and Paste. Next slide, please. So what were the problems? The door itself was very much a very well-used object. Over the years, stickers were added, sometimes on top of other stickers, sometimes one or more stickers are keeping other stickers in place. Lots of them are lifting, peeling. There might be accretions on the adhesive, some are torn, some were detached completely. There's also a range of materials, so you've got stickers made of paper, but also a variety of polymers, including puffy stickers that have got a foam layer in between. You've got metallic stickers, PVC contact adhesion stickers, and even pom-poms with googly eyes and sticky paper feet. Our curator is very, very keen to retain the signs of usage because of its reflection of the object's life and how the donor used it, but it would also need to withstand transportation, open display, and being displayed alongside pristine works of art and being able to hold its own in that setting, in a very clean gallery setting, which is very different from the setting of the Museum of Childhood if you visited. Next slide, please. So the discussion, as always, started with me locking our curator in a display case. No, not really. I worked very, very closely with our curator, one of the curators for the Museum of Childhood. This is Lynn Stevens, and I haven't really locked her in the case. And we spent a lot of time considering these different issues. Generally, we were in agreement, but there was a very clear sense from Lynn that a certain level of wear and preserving that wear was crucial to the authenticity of the object, whereas obviously for me, stability for transport, packing and display were the priorities. And due to the extent of the damage and the sheer number of stickers, documentation was also going to be crucial to the borrower while monitoring the condition of the object while it was on display. So the things that we discussed were, how much sticking down do we do? What different adhesives might we need to use for the different types of stickers? And some of them might, because of the nature of the plastic stickers that were contact adhesion stickers, it might not be as easily reversible. Why were things lifting? If they were lifting, should we leave them because they would have been lifting a couple of years into the lifetime of the object? Basically, it all came down to, is it stable enough to travel? We don't need to make it look perfect. Can we secure it but preserve its authenticity and show that it is something that has been developed over a really long period? Next slide, please. So the plan basically involved a fairly minimal sticking down, actually, of stickers in order to make things stable. And the bigger job was the condition report. There was a greater reliance than ever on annotated images, because writing individually what stickers were loose and so on was just not going to cut it. It needed to be usable for the borrower. So there was significant annotation of images to show what was lifting, so that nobody worried at either end of the loan period. The door was divided up into 4 different sections and condition checked section by section, so that it was really obvious what was loose, what was lifting, and anything else that might be a cause for concern. And this particularly came into its own, this level of detail, when during the course of the exhibition, one of the exhibition entry stickers was in fact added to the door by a member of the public, and was miraculously spotted by an eagle-eyed member of the front of house staff. It was safely removed, don't worry, but in fact Lynn and I did have a conversation about maybe that carries on the purpose of the object, and should the sticker actually stay there, because the door has been collecting stickers for a really long time, and is that something that, you know, is part of its story, and should it have been left? Always going to be an interesting discussion to consider the authenticity of objects such as this that are never really complete. Next slide, please. So that's all for me. If you've got any questions, let me know. And I've also shared a link here about Craig J. Lowe, who made the sticker door, talking about his childhood door and being very, very amused that he's being listed alongside world-renowned artists as a creator and maker. Thank you very much.
Great. Thanks, Gwen. And as I work at the National Galleries of Scotland, I can report that that object did spark a lot of conversation within the galleries, and that it certainly used to cheer me up on my way to meetings when I went past it in the corridor. Quite miss it now, it's not there anymore. I'm now going to introduce our second speaker, who is Simona Cenci. She's book and paper conservator at the National Library of Scotland, and Simona's talk is entitled Resumption Survey, a simple analytical tool for checking the condition of collections after lockdown. So over to you, Simona.
Thank you very much, Isobel, and hello, everybody. I would like to thank Icon Scotland for organising this event and for inviting me to present this paper. Today I'm going to talk about the Resumption survey carried out on the National Library of Scotland collection stores prior to the reopening of the library premises to staff and public after the lockdowns. The talk will briefly illustrate the challenges encountered in choosing the best format to carry out a survey of such large scale in a limited amount of time, and the exceptional team endeavour that the task has required. I am aware that such procedures seem thankfully to belong to the past. Nevertheless, I hope that the methodological outcomes could be a useful toolkit for survey projects of large-scale collections, and will instigate conversation on the value of such investigation as a routine preventive process. Next slide, please. The scope of the survey was to assess the condition of the collections after many weeks of forced closure during the exceptional circumstance of the pandemic. The process proposed to identify any problems outstanding the reduction of the routine activities dedicated to the preservation of spaces and collections during the lockdown period, and to identify the consequences of unforeseen problems that might have not been spotted during that period, and therefore to prevent the need for costly and time-consuming conservation activities due to the lack of immediate action to those problems. To place the project in context, the survey had involved inspection of 2 library buildings for a total of 16 floors of collection material and around 2,600 stacks or aisles. Because the time allocated for the survey was 10 days, it appeared immediately evident that the process required involvement of all members of the collections care team, including those that are not trained conservators. The form for the survey then needed to be concise, clear, and as exhaustive as possible. Next slide, please. Each floor was assessed by a team of 2 people by checking against a list of targeted preventive parameters. The parameters aim to assess any physical damage, water ingress, debris, dust, biological and microbiological activity affecting the collections and/or the collection spaces. Next slide, please. The survey results were recorded on a spreadsheet containing a checklist of the parameters and the building's floor plans. The plans were inserted to the document to help the surveyors navigating the spaces and were used as a supplement in recording the areas of incidence. The checklist guided the surveyors on what to look for, simplified the data inputs, avoiding the use of long sentences, and helped uniform data. Next slide, please. Plans were considered strategic tools to keep track of the workflow. The division of the floor plans into small areas was in fact carried out with the precise intent to track the surveying progress. Before starting the survey, each member assigned a time frame to each area and checked their progression regularly against the set time frame. Next slide, please. Because the scope of the survey was to highlight any evident damage or anomaly, it was intended as a walk through the collection aisles. With this concept in mind, the interaction with the material, such as the removal of objects from the shelves for individual assessment, was reduced to the minimal and reserved only to exceptional circumstances. Instead, the attention was diverted to suspicious and unusual situations, such as pipes or sprinkler heads actively leaking, water stains on the floors or shelves, suspicious moldy and damp smell, or visible signs of pest or microbiological damage. The walk through the stores progressed smoothly as no major damages or problems were found, and the survey that was scheduled to be completed in 10 days was unexpectedly completed in 4 days after the first lockdown and 2 days after the second lockdown. This positive result was possible thanks to my wonderful colleagues who engaged with the process with enthusiasm and an exceptional goal-driven approach. The completion of the survey would have not been possible without this collective endeavor. After a long period of forced isolation, this project was the first opportunity to work safely distanced but physically together again. And I would like to take this opportunity to thank my colleagues for transforming a daunting task in an enjoyable teamwork experience. Last slide, please. Thank you very much for your attention, and back to you, Isobel.
That was great. Thank you very much, Simona. Very well explained. As you started off, I was wondering how on earth you would have made it through 16 floors in 10 days, but it all makes sense now, so thank you. Our next speaker is Anna Robinson from Glasgow University, and she is going to talk about peeling back the layers, treatment of a large Scottish sampler. So over to you, please, Anna.
Thank you, Isobel. My name's Anna. I'm a second year student at the Centre for Textile Conservation at the University of Glasgow. As part of my practical work at the centre over the past year, I was tasked with assessing and treating a large sampler, one of 2 belonging to a private client. The sampler, which dated from the 1850s, measured 69 by 67 centimeters and is composed of a total of 44 different colors of embroidery yarn, wool yarn on a cotton ground, and was embellished with 4 different types of beads. It arrived in a wooden frame with glass glazing, and the glazing had 1 large and several small breaks in the bottom left corner, which was causing it to rest directly on the surface of the sampler. The client, whose great aunt had made the sampler, wanted it to be cleaned and treated so that it can be returned to its frame and hug in their home. Next slide, please. In order to minimize any damage from the broken glazing and to be able to fully assess the condition of the sampler, it needed to be removed from the frame. So after documentation of the sampler in its frame, the framing tape and staples securing it to the black mat board backing were carefully cut, allowing the frame and glazing to be removed. After doing this, it became clear that there were more support layers than originally thought. Additionally, when the framing and glazing were removed, it was revealed that the gummed paper tape and mat board backing used in the framing remained affixed to the edges of the sampler with a combination of staples and the tape adhesive, some of which you can see in the image on the right of this slide. An ultrasonic humidifier was used to soften the adhesive of the gummed paper tape where it was attached to the sampler, allowing it to be removed from the sampler and the sampler to be separated from the mat board backing. Next slide, please. Removal of the mat board backing revealed more layers of material supporting the sampler, including a wooden stretcher covered in 2 pieces of a patterned brown paper, which was held in place with sellotape and adhesive. The adhesive, which held the sampler to the paper and the paper to the stretcher, appeared yellowed and cracked, but still had a strong bond. Visual analysis combined with research and the testing of the adhesive layer between the paper and the wood with water suggested that it was likely an animal glue. Based on this assumption, the adhesive layer attaching the paper to the wooden stretcher was humidified. While this treatment initially appeared successful at removing the paper layer, it was determined that the paper was softened during the humidification and not the adhesive. After consultation with my client and tutors, it was decided that the paper would not be kept as part of the object, and so further humidification to remove it from the sampler was acceptable. Next slide, please. Having managed to remove all of the framing and support layers, I was finally able to access the back of the sampler, revealing the brightness of the original colors. The 2 left-hand images showing the front and back of the sampler demonstrate how much of the colors had faded on the front. The paper support had left adhesive accretions around the perimeter of the back of the sampler. Failed attempts at softening the adhesive with water during the removal of the paper led to analytical testing, which determined that the adhesive was not a protein glue as originally suspected. While we were unable to positively identify the adhesive, testing determined that xylene could be used to swell the adhesive, allowing it to be peeled from the surface of the fibers with minimal loss. The solvent was applied using a 2% agarose gel, cut into strips and applied directly to the adhesive for 40 minutes, before the softened adhesive was peeled away using tweezers. Next slide, please. The slow process of removing the many framing and support layers on the sampler was ultimately very rewarding, as it allowed it to be cleaned on both sides, revealing more of the detail and colors of the embroidery. I was also able to support the fragile edges of the sampler using a combination of stitched patches and nylon net. While the sampler was unable to be returned to its original frame after treatment, it is now supported on a padded board, which will allow it to be safely framed in the future. Thank you for your attention.
Thanks very much, Anna. That was great. Nice to have some lovely pictures. Our next speaker is the conservator who's nobly joining us in the middle of the night. So this is Lucilla Ronai, who's joining us in the National Library of Australia, and she's going to talk about creating a conservation YouTube channel, curating conservation content for the general public. So over to you, Lucilla, please.
Hi everyone, I'm very excited to be joining you from Australia. So my name's Lucilla, and in the depths of a lockdown last year, I decided to create a conservation YouTube channel called The Conservation Starter, despite having never created a video before. So over 14 months, I created 24 videos, and that included filming, editing, and uploading them. And you can see sort of a summary of that process up on the screen. But I found it wasn't quite as simple as all that. So I'm wanting to share some of the lessons I've learned over the last 14 months for creating and curating content for the general public, because it is really important that we share our work. So next slide, please. So here are some fast facts you need to know. I think conservation is really well shared over video because it's both visual and audible. And YouTube is a very natural platform to share this because it is both a video sharing platform, but also a social media platform. It also has incredible searchability and discoverability because it is actually one of the world's largest search engines, second only to Google. And so it means that a whole new audience can find out about conservation. YouTube is also an educational platform, and one of the best things about it is you don't have to create content for YouTube. You can just simply consume it, and there are some incredible conservation videos and channels out there, but there's not many, and we can always do with more. Next slide, please. So here are some lessons learned about creating videos. In terms of equipment, you don't need expensive equipment at all. You can just use what you have access to. Most of the time when I'm doing treatments and I'm trying to capture footage, I'm just using my phone in the lab. And as you can see on the image on the left, you just make do with what you have, even if it's just stools. Also, very quickly discovered that talking to a camera is very different from talking to a live audience. And things that you can do to overcome that is practice, like we're all doing with Zoom. But also there are alternatives to people talking directly to the camera. You can do voiceovers and instead have the footage focusing on people's hands and the object. And also there's such thing as multiple takes and editing. So editing can fix a lot of things. On that, editing is everything, including the biggest time suck. So on the right, you can see an example of one of my editing files. So for every minute of footage you do, it generally takes 3 hours to produce. So that's from start to finish, filming all the way up to uploading. So if you have an 8-minute video, that can take more than 24 hours to create. But with editing, you can be so creative and share conservation information in so many different ways. You have the main footage and dialogue, but you can also then add text and overlays and graphics and sound and music. So it's really powerful. Next slide, please. So in terms of uploading and also creating a YouTube channel, there are so many resources out there that will literally detail step-by-step how to do this. So I'm not going to touch on that here. But some of the things you really do need to know is if you're going to go to the trouble of making videos, you need to make sure they're discovered. So research is really important to work out how the public talks about us and things that they might want to be searching for. So the way that they refer to our work is how they'll be searching for it. So it'll change what they discover. So using that research to help you title your videos and use it for your metadata, descriptions and tags will really help your content to be discovered by the public. And also you can use the YouTube analytics to learn from your videos and see what works and what doesn't work. So another interesting thing I found out is once you upload a video, many months later, it can start to have a surge in popularity. So the idea is with YouTube, videos can continue to be discovered. It's not superseded by more recent content. So if you are creating videos, it's a really good idea to make sure it's sort of what they call evergreen content and it will continue to be relevant. Next slide, please. So in terms of sharing videos once they're up on YouTube, you've of course got your YouTube link and you can share that on social media and it will generally come up with a little preview as well. But what's really good is once the video is up on YouTube, you can generally embed that video into websites and play it through that. So it's a really powerful way to share your content. Also, if you go to the trouble of creating a video, because it does take so much time, most social media platforms these days actually support video content. So there's no reason why you can't reuse that material, whether it's just a snippet or the whole thing, and share it on Twitter or Instagram or something like that. Next slide, please. And now lessons learned with the public. So one of the most rewarding things is once my videos were up, it was the interactions with the public that I found to be the most enjoyable part of it, but also the most challenging. On the left, you can see some examples of some really good interactions or interesting ones or weird ones. For example, my cat peed on my old photos, help. And then you also can have the not so great interactions. There's some examples of those on the right. So the problem with YouTube videos is once you put it out there, you have no control over who watches the videos and how they'll interpret and interact with them. So these are all examples of people actually commenting directly on the videos. In terms of if it's very negative or the comments are a bit too much, you can delete comments, but often if it's negative, I find that a good thumbs up and just being like, yeah, you're entitled to your opinion is just as good. So you are opening yourself up to potential critique, both as an individual and as a profession, but I think it's definitely worth it. So you do definitely need to monitor the interactions, and there's a very good way to track this through the YouTube platform. Something else that I really struggled with the general public was working out what to show, what's too much and what is ethical. So it's kind of been a big balance for me to work that out. YouTube is a platform known for its DIY videos and extreme restorations done by people that are definitely not conservators. And then also some situations where conservators, well, people presenting themselves as conservators, are doing treatments that sacrifice the object for a good video shot. So I was wanting to show that there's alternatives to this. And I want people to be educated about conservation through the videos, but not feel like they have gotten a conservation education. So in no way do my videos encourage people to do their own treatments at home, on the bench, kitchen bench, and, you know, using solvents and things like that. That is not the intention at all. So yeah, this is sort of the biggest challenge for me in trying to find out that line. And I also found that context is everything. So if I do give information, I do give sort of my decision making behind treatments, that really does help to contextualize what I'm showing in terms of treatments. Next slide, please. So just to quickly conclude, not everyone wants to create videos or be in them, but it is definitely possible for a conservator who has no knowledge of creating videos like me to learn how to do it. I really do believe that the more conservation content created by conservators out there, the better. And even if we're not creating the content ourselves, I feel like we do need to be part of the process of creating the videos. Often we're just put in front of the camera and we're not given much opportunity to give input in terms of the editing or the sharing of the video after we're in front of the camera. So people really want to know about conservation. I think we should be the ones telling them about it. So I'm going to continue to make conservation videos and hopefully learn a lot more about sharing conservation with the public. Thank you.
Thanks, Lucilla. That was great. And I think that final point you make about wanting to influence the filming process rather than just being the passive person stuck behind the camera is really interesting. So we'll look forward to probing that some more when we get onto the questions. So we're now on to our final presentation. This is a double act from Ruth Honeybone and Daryl Green from the University of Edinburgh, and very kindly prompted by when I heard Ruth talking about this incident in a meeting and asked her if she would do a presentation, because I just felt it was something that there was such a good learning experience for us all. So they're going to talk about surviving insurance claim documentation with a smile. Over to you, Ruth, please.
Thanks, Isobel. I was going to open by thanking you for the invitation to speak about what is arguably the least visually arresting conservation subject matter imaginable. But also thanks to Alina and Icon Scotland for organising today's session. We've managed to get through an involved insurance claim still smiling, and while the hope is that your collections are spared all this, I'll look at documentation and Daryl will talk about collection valuation should you find yourself in our position. Could I have the next slide, please, Krista? So in August 2019, we had substantial rainwater ingress to a store that affected about 50,000 rare books, of which about 2,500 had to be air dried or put in frozen storage. And we documented absolutely everything at this stage: staff time on salvage, materials used in the salvage operation, other associated costs like taxis and freezer hire, and we produced an inventory of all the wet items with an assigned damage category. And all this became the raw data on which we based our insurance claim. Next slide, please. Our process can be broken down into 3 stages, with numerous phone calls and emails between them to refine each submission. The first documentation stage, which was submitted to the loss adjuster about 2 months after the incident, provided evidence for the salvage costs that we'd already incurred and a proposal for how the repair work would be managed. And we applied some broad treatment timings to the damage categories in that inventory and used them to cost out contracting the work to commercial practice or doing it in-house with project staff. And we'd flagged the latter as our preference, but it turned out this was not our insurer's norm. And even though it was the lowest cost, it raised an awful lot of questions for them. So in the second stage, we provided written answers to queries about how we were going to do the work by giving detail about treatment processes, timeframes, project roles and grades, and our studio facilities. We also had to provide some reassurance that this approach wouldn't result in a different overall outcome for the affected material, and that it would not increase value beyond the pre-incident level. The final stage came at the point when both parties had agreed to a one-off settlement upfront rather than staggered payments in arrears, and we reviewed our original proposal in light of all of this. So what have we learned? Even taking into account a pandemic, this was a protracted process. We got final agreement in March, so be prepared for the long haul. It's a real team effort with conservators, collection specialists and senior managers working together. And finally, be ready to answer what we would consider very basic questions about what conservators do in order to justify costs and understand the impact of proposed treatment on collection value. And on the subject of value, I will hand over to Daryl.
Okay, thank you, Ruth. So it was at this point where I stepped in, both in terms of my role as head of special collections, but also as a new employee to the university. And it was a good point to step in because we had hit a bit of a glass ceiling with the insurers and loss adjusters in terms of discussing what the value of the collection was. And part of this was getting beyond the initial shock and awe of seeing, splayed books and wet books. But two is finding a mutual language that we could speak with the insurers to understand how to actually value the damage of the collection. Insurers were used to kind of thinking about restoring the value of a collection, where instead we needed to get these books back to a usable order so they could be put out in the reading room or for teaching spaces, but they didn't need to be returned to some kind of pristine condition. So how did we do this? Next slide, please. So in order to communicate some kind of value, we had to bring in an independent valuer to look at the collections that were damaged. We took the sheet that was constructed by conservation and collections management colleagues, which had categories of damage of each of the 2,400 volumes. And that valuer was, oh dear, sorry. I'm very sorry about this.
The government has made the wearing of face coverings and
apologies about that, working in the office. Very sorry about that. Anyway, so in terms of determining value, we got an independent valuer to provide a market value of each book as it would be in pristine condition, and then use the damage categories to reduce that book's value by a certain percentage. By doing that exercise, we're able to arrive at a value of what was lost in the collection. And from that, we were able to determine whether or not we would be able to deliver a project to return the collections to a usable state, but also to return some value to the collection as well. At the university, cultural heritage collections are part of the bottom line of the university's annual submission. Next slide, please. So we were able to achieve a figure. We were able to arrive at that figure and to get the lump sum payouts. And so what's next? Well, one, what's nice about lump sum payouts is there's no further paperwork to do with the insurers. Once the payout is finished, that's them done. Two then is to begin the project. So for this audience, just so you're aware, we will be recruiting for 2 new positions at the university later this year for conservation and assistant conservator on this project, and we also have 2 other roles that we'll be recruiting for on other projects as well. Thank you very much. I'll stop there.
Thanks, Ruth and Daryl. That was great, and good to have hard evidence that you really are at work and not just sitting in your bedrooms in your pajamas or whatever. So thank you for that. That was great. I'm now going to ask all the speakers to put their cameras on so that we can have a Q&A, and I should say a big thank you to you all as well. You did a great job, and it was great. As always, we had a really good mix of talks. And viewers, if you want to switch to gallery view, that will mean that you'll get everybody up on your screen at the same time. So I'm going to read out questions from the Q&A and probably chuck in a few of my own and direct them to the speakers. And if further questions or comments occur to you while we're doing that, please feel free to type in extra questions. If possible, please use the Q&A rather than the chat, because it'll make my life easier if I don't have to switch between the two. So I'm going to kick off with a question for Gwen, if that's okay. I knew you were going to get asked this, Gwen. In fact, I wrote it down myself. What kind of adhesive did you use for sticking down the stickers?
Mostly wheat starch paste for the paper-based stickers. For the sort of contact adhesion ones, so they're basically like, you know, static, but the static had gone. I actually tried just water, just like making it slightly damp to see if that would help bring that back, but it didn't. And so we did have a bit of back and forth, and in the end I did use Paraloid B72.
And did your documentation go down to the level of noting exactly where you'd put adhesive, or did you just kind of write a general summary of what you'd done?
No, my treatment report had that. I mean, because I was able to, because most of the adhesive that I used was sorry, one of my dogs seems to be crying. He doesn't like me talking. Sorry. Yes, mostly because it was wheat starch paste. I didn't need to put that on the image. I could just circle, and then I used a different color for the ones that used Paraloid B72, so it could be very easily seen what had been adhered with what.
Okay, brilliant. Thanks, Gwen. I'm going to come on to Simona next and ask about your survey forms, Simona. Did you kind of make them up from scratch, or did you borrow or copy from anything else that you found out there already?
No, I created them for this purpose, and I think for the checklist I was looking at standards mostly to highlight maybe what it was the crucial thing to look for in such conditions. And I think the big work was to look with the plans, divide them for all the 16 floors, and attach every section of the plan to the checklist. I think the preparation was quite long. I think we have the beneficial time of being in lockdown, so we could maybe spend a little bit more time on those type of organizational, let's say, aspects. But I think that this made the survey on the floors much faster and speedier. And also the idea was to uniform a lot, because it was a lot of different people doing the survey. I think, yeah, it was done on purpose, yeah, for that. Yeah.
Thanks, Simona. And actually that leads me on to the other thing I was going to ask you, which was, you know, to what extent did you have to try, and did you find that you got a range of data and you had to kind of quality control it or standardize it, or did you manage to get your form designed in such a way that everything was pretty uniform?
I think, yeah, no, I think that more or less what to look for was the same on the different buildings, although they are different buildings, and the material, as I said, the look was not on the material itself or on the specifics of the material, but it was more to look on possible damages or things that would have incurred during this period. So it was relatively easy to uniform the forms and also the plans to this. Did it answer your question?
Yeah, that's what I was wondering, really, whether you managed to get the data in a uniform manner or not, and it sounds like you did.
Oh yes, at the end, yeah. I mean, on top of that, at the end, I think there was a sort of a general reviewing spreadsheet where all the data were put together, and you could see for each floor what was the problem. And thankfully, I mean, I have to say that the forms were blank most of the time, so thankfully we didn't find any major problems, so it wasn't that difficult. But initially I tried to link the tabs to a general form that was automatically filling as we were working through the stacks. But because we weren't sure that on each stack the Wi-Fi signal was arrived, I think we had to split the forms and then do this sort of final resume at the end. But it wasn't that long, thankfully, because the data we didn't find any huge problem. And the idea of the survey was to highlight the problems. So if you don't find any, the form is blank. So yeah, thank you. Sorry, I was very long.
No, that was great. Thanks, Simona. We've got some for Anna now about her treatment. So somebody's asking about the agar gel, and before we got onto that, Anna, just a more general question. Did you go straight for the agar gel, or did you experiment with a range of different approaches for applying the xylene to get rid of the adhesive?
I tried a few different methods of applying the solvent for softening the adhesive, including swabbing and dropping, as well as using different types of poultices. But ultimately, I found the agar gel to be most effective because it can be used more directly without causing tide lines. Because I was unable to wet clean the sampler because some of the embroidery yarns bleed in water, just like deionized water. So there was a lot of cellulose degradation in there still, which could easily have been moved around by contact with too much moisture. So it was a major concern about softening the adhesive, was not creating tide lines at the same time.
Okay, thank you. And then there's a question from somebody who clearly knows their agar gels, asking what concentration of solvent you used, and did you have any issues with getting the gel to keep the gelling to keep in place when the solvent was added?
So the way I did mine was I created a 2% solution of agar gel as a block, like a thin block, and then soaked it in the xylene solvent, undiluted, just on its own, for probably about 40 minutes to an hour before applying it to the adhesive, and then would just use fresh strips for each part of the adhesive. So there weren't any issues with holding a gel form because it wasn't put in solution.
Okay, great. Thanks, Anna. Got some questions for Lucilla about making her videos. One of the questions, Lucilla, was what kind of content did you include in your videos? How did you decide what to film and what would interest people?
That's a very good question. So I think there's two different sides: what conservators want to show people and what people actually want to know. So initially, the first few videos I did were just centered around objects and their treatments, and people are very interested in that. So I already happen to have, the before and after treatments, and I already had time lapses, because I should say this also happened during lockdown, so I wasn't in the lab. So this was just what I already had on my phone. And then as it went on, I realized that there was just so many people asking the exact same questions of what is conservation? How do you become a conservator? So these big, more overarching sort of ones. So from that sort of feedback, I started to cater the content to what people actually wanted to hear. So that kind of helped me decide what content for the videos. And in terms of the line of what's too much and what's not enough to show to keep people interested, each video I keep finding out more. And there's some that I've definitely regretted sharing some of the things, because I've already, you just open yourself up to critique, and sometimes even from your peers. So yeah, it's kind of nerve-wracking, but ultimately worth it, I think.
Thank you. And there've been a few questions along the lines of getting permission. So I don't know whether you had to get, because you work for the National Library of Australia, don't you? So did you have to get permission from them to do what you did? And somebody asked about copyright. Was there any copyright issues with the objects you were showing?
Yeah, so funny story. When I only started the National Library a month ago, so when I was making all these videos, I was at the Maritime Museum.
Okay.
So I worked very closely at the Maritime Museum with the social media team, and we actually in our collection management system had a way to check the copyright status of material and also to work out if it was sensitive at all. So I had a way of finding that all out, and a lot of these objects I was already supplying this content to the social media team that was sharing it through Instagram posts and things like that. So in terms of copyright, I always made sure to be very careful about that and to follow what the copyright restrictions were. And in terms of getting permission from the museum, they were very aware of the YouTube channel and enjoyed it. And I think the idea was, as long as I wasn't doing it in work time and as long as, you know, I was representing the museum well and professionally, they were really happy because I was sharing the collection. I would say that probably the first 4 videos I did were centered around collection objects, and sort of since then I've made it more general about conservation and approaches. And some of my videos about photographs, I was using my grandma's photos at home. So, you know, you can just use mock objects. You don't actually have to use collection objects for these kinds of videos. I think that answered all the parts of the question.
That was brilliant. Thank you. So I'm going to come to Ruth and Daryl next then. A question about whether any costs that you were unable to recover from the claim, and if so, what, and was there any learning you can share about that?
Ruth, you want to take that?
I'll kick off. One of the first things that we did was write a list of everything that we thought we might like to get money for. It was a comprehensive list, and we included what we'd already incurred, what we needed to restore the collections to a usable, stable condition, preventive measures around the building so that we didn't have rainwater ingress problems in the future. And we also looked at the shelving as well, so the kind of fixtures and fittings. And we put that to our internal insurance person who looked through it and carved off the bits that were not covered in the policy. So anything to do with the building fabric was covered by a different policy, so that was out. And anything that was preventive was not covered, but was expected by the insurers. They were looking at us doing that kind of thing for the next year's premium. So that then brought it down to costs we'd already incurred and costs that we expected to incur to bring the material back to a stable and usable condition. I hope that answers the question.
Just to add to that, because the damage took place now 2 financial years ago, in a way we already had written off the cost of the labor that had already gone into the salvage operation, and so by doing that in terms of internal accounting and just absorbing the cost, we were then able to make sure that we had enough budget to deliver the remediation and conservation project, which is now getting ready to open.
Great, thank you both of you. And a kind of related question about the conservation work. Have you estimated the time required to complete the conservation work? Which I think you said you did, but you could just clarify that. And also, I would ask, you know, have you then tracked, or maybe you haven't, you know, are you going to kind of track how much time it actually takes? It'd be quite an interesting operation in itself to see whether your estimate matches up to the reality.
So we had 3 main damage categories: minor, moderate and extreme, and we put a nominal timing to each of those, and each item that sat within each category added a time to the overall. So it is based on proper assessment, but of course it has some, you know, room for manoeuvre in it when we actually get down to the work itself. But absolutely, yes, we are going to track, because it will be very interesting to see how that original assessment relates to the reality. But in the review at the final stage of documentation submission, we have built in contingency so that we are in a good position should our timings turn out to be slightly off.
Great, thanks Ruth. And Daryl is nodding as if he thinks you've said all the right stuff there. Yeah. Okay, brilliant. I'll see if I've got time to whiz around everybody once again with a quick question. So I'm going back to you, Gwen. Question about, did you have strict relative humidity and temperature requirements for the door, and did it show any signs of reacting, for example, to RH fluctuations?
No, it was on open display, and it was in an alcove off a staircase, and it was behind a barrier, so somebody with adding the sticker was chancing their arm. But no, it seems pretty stable. I mean, it was in a house like that for 25 years before it came to the museum, so it would have had extremely changeable conditions, so it's actually quite robust. It's just because it's made up of so many different elements, and you can't legislate for every single one of the stickers. Like I say, some the glue had failed and come off, fully detached, but that didn't, during the period on display, it was fine. It came back and it was very happy.
Great, thanks, Gwen. And then Anna, there was a question for you. Somebody says that was a great synopsis of a complex treatment. And what do you think was the most valuable aspect of the treatment for your own learning?
I think the most valuable aspect for me was remembering what part of an object like this is the purpose of the treatment. I had a lot of personal anxiety about removing the paper because it was causing damage to the paper. Having to humidify it off, and the other option was to cut it off, and there was a lot of angst about that, and being reminded that I wasn't actually treating the paper was sort of secondary, and we did actually manage to salvage most of it, but yeah, remembering what the priority in a treatment was, I think the part that I learned the most from it.
Brilliant, thank you. I'm going back to Simona. Final question for you, Simona. In terms of the data that you produced, did you manage to kind of get statistical information out of it, or was that not really what you were aiming for? Were you able to say the number of incidents or the percentage of the collection that seemed worse or anything like that?
I don't think we had that many in order to create statistics, not that many incidents in order to create statistics, but I think we could see, I think the floors with a more holistic view, and also I think the fact of having assessed all the collection at the same time with all the team, I think it gave a sort of a deeper knowledge, and it kind of started conversation on other aspects that I think they go beyond the statistic of the resumption survey or what you can find after the lockdown. So I think this is maybe the main thing that we found. I think it was a very useful experience for all the team, and yeah, for these reasons.
Yeah, thanks, Simona. Yeah, I can imagine it's the only time in history that you've ever looked at the collection kind of right across the board. So
yeah, and those together, at the same time, because it tends to be maybe more localized or with projects, while it was very holistic. So yes, yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks.
One for Lucilla: tips for speaking to camera. I've done one training video and realised I should have sort of sorted my hair out better, says Katie. Any tips to share, Lucilla?
Yeah, it's kind of a weird thing. Often, if you're talking to the camera, you kind of need to give way more energy than you expect. If you are normally talking at maybe 60% energy, you need to give like 80 to 90% energy to the camera to make it translate across, because you're essentially talking to a camera that then needs to come through a screen and be perceived by people. So when I was starting out, I found it really useful to have someone in the room with me, and it led to a lot more bloopers and funny moments, but then I had a chance to relax and be able to talk to that person and then go back to the camera. So that really helped. In terms of like continuity, and if you're changing your hair and changing your position, when you're one-on-one at home during lockdown, it's quite hard to ensure that. You can cover that with editing. So if you find that you're cutting from one bit of talking to another, and you've completely changed your hair, if you cover the cut with, you know, an image of the object you're talking about, people don't seem to notice as much. I think conservators are far more focused on the details than most of the general public are. And then also I had an opportunity to use my video editing and creating skills, and at the Maritime Museum the team created a collection safety video. So we actually had a bit of a crew, so we'd have a speaker and there would be myself and someone else with the camera and helping them work through the script, and then you have people to check on continuity for you and be like, oh, there's your spot. You can even mark out where people need to stand and have the angles of the tripods and everything. So it was like a mini introduction to what people on film sets do. So it was very good fun.
Brilliant, thank you. And a final one for Ruth and Daryl. I was wondering, you know, given that this is a library collection, so you've got masses of stuff, and probably don't have wonderful condition data item by item. Did that matter? That did the insurance company expect you to have data about what the collection was like? Maybe you did, and I'm just imagining. But were they looking for detailed information about what the collection was like before the incident happened? Or was that not an issue for them?
I think that's probably a valuation related question. In terms of conservation treatment, they weren't interested in item by item. They wanted
that's good.
all approaches, but it came in a bit more in terms of valuation. Of course, they don't want to pay out thousands of pounds to treat a volume that's worth £50. So that was a factor for them, but I certainly didn't have to supply any item level conservation treatment information.
Yeah, the valuation exercise was really interesting actually, because the majority of this collection had a blanket valuation on it, but not an item by item valuation. And there was one item in particular that was a 17th century English navigational book that, with maps, was valued at a six-figure sum that would have tipped the insurance claim very healthily in our direction. And so there was a few instances where the valuation was done as a desktop exercise because we were working during lockdowns. And there was one or two books that we had to go send somebody in to check and actually put underneath a visualizer, a webcam, with the valuers and with the insurers, so they could see that it didn't have the maps, and so therefore wasn't worth the six-figure sum that was its original market value. So there was some dancing back and forth, but by and large, it was on. I mean, the insurers that we work with are used to dealing with cultural heritage organizations and know that most don't have an item by item valuation.
Okay, great, thank you. That was I was right in my suspicion that we needed you to come and talk about that. So thank you very much. And I think that kind of gets us to the end of our hour. I'd like to say a really big thank you to our speakers, who as always have made this a really engaging and informative session and coped admirably with the demands of presenting on Zoom, even with random alarms going off and so on. And also a big thank you to Elena for organising the event, to Krista and Hazel, who've done the IT support, and to our social media officers, Gemma and Marta, who always do a great job with publicity. And thank you also to our attendees, who, as always, came up with some brilliant questions. Just before we go, I want to take the opportunity to remind you all about a webinar that we've got coming up soon. It's about the CMOP project, about cleaning modern paintings. It's a big collaborative research project that Tate have been involved in, about cleaning water-sensitive modern oil paints. And they're giving a webinar about that. It's Bronwyn Ormsby, who is the principal conservation scientist, and Judith Lee, conservation scientist. Yeah, and they're going to talk about Tate's contributions to the CMOP project. So we're really lucky to have them, because I know I've heard them say a bit about that project before, and it's a really interesting project. So I'd encourage you all to sign up. 8th of July, 4 till 6. Massive bit of CPD that you can tick off your list. You'll be an expert on oil paints forevermore. And on that cheery note, I'd like to say thank you to everybody again, and goodbye, and hope to see you all soon. Thank you. Bye.